Welcome to the Dandelion Effect podcast, a space for organic conversation about the magic of living a connected life. Just like the natural world around us, we are all linked through an intricate web, a never-ending ripple that spans across the globe. Here, we explore the ideas that our guests carry through the world, remember who and what inspired them along the way, and uncover the seeds that help them blossom into their unique version of this human experience. This podcast is in partnership with the Feathered Pipe Foundation, whose mission is to help people find their direction through access to programs and experiences that support healing, education, community, and empowerment. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Dandelion Effect podcast. Today's guest is Sarah Bergakker. Sarah is a certified nurse anesthetist and the founder of Mooxli, a company dedicated to providing self-care resources and continuing education for healthcare workers. Mooxli stands for Move Your Mind, Oxygenate Your Soul, and Live Life Differently. And it was born out of Sarah's personal experience in the healthcare industry for the last quarter century. She navigated through emotional, mental, and physical challenges that her professional training didn't at all prepare her for. This conversation really is an important one. We talk about the prevalence of burnout, substance abuse, and suicide among nurses and physicians, and these statistics absolutely blew my mind. We uncover the hidden feelings that many in this field keep bottled up for fear of going against the industry's, quote, "there's no crying in the ER" culture. Sarah lets us in on a secret. There is, in fact, a lot of crying among staff, but most of it happens behind closed doors and in isolation. Through Mooxli, Sarah has created a safe and supportive community where these healthcare professionals can learn how to care for themselves first, because it's impossible to pour from an empty cup, even when running on empty has been historically rewarded in their line of work. Her team helps people process emotions, release the stories that they carry from their patients, and navigate the moral dilemma of being asked to constantly choose the well-being of others over their own. Mooxli provides the tools of yoga, purpose practices, and true resilience training through its online community, through book clubs, retreats, and continuing education workshops. I really hope you find this conversation eye-opening and helpful. I know I really did. And if not for you personally, then please share with someone you know, whether they are in the field or they are experiencing some of the things that we'll talk about today. Without further ado, please welcome Sarah Bergakker. You talk very openly about your personal experience as a nurse, and I have loved getting to know you as a new teacher at the Feathered Pipe Ranch. So introduce us to who you are from that angle and just the ways that you find yourself in the place that you're in today with the work you're doing.
My personal journey started in healthcare when I was quite young. I took my first nursing boards when I was 18 years old. I knew very early on that I wanted to end up in healthcare and started the prerequisites for nursing school while I was in high school. That meant that I found myself standing as a nurse in the trauma room in the emergency department when I was 19 years old. Very typical of people in healthcare, very type A, very goal-oriented. And so I had done the didactic, the book work to be there. But I found myself standing in the trauma room without having the tools to process emotionally what I was seeing so early in my career and at a fairly young age. Now, I'm at a point in my life where I can bring that awareness to it and bring those words to it, but I didn't know that that's what I was going through. The saying, "there's no crying in baseball," we would say, well, there's no crying in the emergency department. And the reality is there's plenty of crying. It's just behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And so I came up through healthcare and then also was in a formative time of my life where the tougher you appeared, the more rewarded you were. And I started in emergency medicine and then transferred to an even busier trauma center. So then I was in my young 20s working, weekend, night shifts, seeing some pretty intense things. And I figured out that if I would hum "Mary Had a Little Lamb" like under my breath during super intense traumas when they would first come into the trauma bay and it's all hands on deck and it's kind of this flurry of activity, that somehow that helped me. And now looking back, I was doing this very like primitive form of just trying to ground myself, right? But I didn't know that at the time. I still remember the night I was working in the ER. They had pulled me out of the pediatric ER to cover the adult ER. And they were like, there's, yet another trauma coming in. I believe it was violent in nature. And I just felt so angry towards that person, this person that was coming in this very compromised state in desperate need of help. And that experience is not foreign to ER nurses. There's some pretty dark, sarcastic coping humor that actually comes out of that. And for me, I remember feeling afraid and feeling like I can't be here anymore. That's not who I want to be. And at the time, I didn't have the tools to know that if I had wanted to, I could have stayed there giving that type of care, but changed who I was as a person. So I'm an Enneagram 3, like we love trophies, we love goals, we love rewards. So I'm like, okay, new goal,
Yes.
new things. So I considered the different paths that I could take and did some shadowing, ended up getting into graduate school for nursing anesthesiology. And it's so all consuming, but it's a great way to numb yourself. It's essentially like you're doing an intense residency. Mine was 28 months long. And I did well for that. Like it was well suited to my personality. I was very successful. But during that 28 months, pretty early on, my husband had always been someone who was so strong in my life and was always pulling us forward together and was such a source of help and love. He had some very unexpected physical problems happen when I was in graduate school and ended up having to have surgery. And then there was complications from that surgery. And that started him on a path from the 12 months when he had his first surgery to when I graduated. He had over 80 appointments and surgeries and therapy. And so the graduate program for nurse anesthesia is known to be very intense. It's has a very high rate of divorce associated with it. So we were already in this really difficult time. And then we started going through something that was, if it was just standalone, would have been incredibly difficult. And the culture in medicine and medical training and nursing training is very, don't let them see you sweat. You don't need to eat. You don't need to sleep. The better and bigger machine you are, the more successful you're going to be here.
I am just seeing so many mirrors in many other fields and many other parts of our culture as a whole.
Yeah, and I appreciate that pause, right? Because it's anti to what we need as humans to succeed in the long term. And so,
not only succeed, survive, maybe even survive is the bare minimum of what that culture promotes.
The crystal clear awareness you have about the toxicity of that is only starting to creep in to healthcare systems and cultures. In the middle of my graduate program, I would not have even been able to put words to it, but with everything that I was going through and my husband was going through, I had just overwhelming anxiety because it was so much. And so I met with my program director and I just said, this is what's going on with my husband. And this is, the surgeries he needs to have. And we were almost ready to head into like the one and only very short holiday break that you get in that program. And she said, you know what? I think that needs to start today for you. And that was the first time somebody in the healthcare training system showed that awareness and compassion and held some space for me. And I see looking back that she planted a seed. So I finished my graduate program and kind of dove headlong into the profession like I had the rest of my life and looked to be very successful by the metrics that are set in healthcare, and was teaching and learning, and I was published and was practicing at a high level of my license. And I found myself about 6 years in a work environment that was toxic and getting more and more toxic. And the area I was practicing in is a small rural town. And an operating room nurse I was working with was like, hey, I have this friend and she's starting yoga in her sister's basement. And like being physically fit goes super well with being type A and achievement oriented. So I was like, yeah, I'll go for the fitness. Because I didn't know that there was anything more to it than that, honestly. I went to Joan's first class, and it was very obvious that she took a whole person and mind, spirit, body approach to yoga. And coming from a science background, I was super skeptical of, my friend calls it crystal sucking woo woo stuff. And so I was like, I don't know about that, but I'm here for the fitness. And in a small town, it's not like there's 3 yoga studios. This was the only yoga game in town. And so I stuck with it. I was very skeptical and very like, I'm fine. Clearly, I'm still learning to honor my journey and where I've been and where I'm going. And my mom raised me that you can learn anything. And so there was a wondering of, is this really the way we have to do this? Because it's getting more and more emotionally painful. And when I started to really open myself up to the mind body work that Joan was sharing with the yoga community, was we were still practicing in her sister's basement at that point, and she assisted me going into plow, which is like a very surrendering pose.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt the strongest internal fight. It was overwhelming for me. And I just remember thinking, whoa, what was that? And that was one of my first experiences of, sometimes when you start by moving the body, you can start to move your mind. And that's, Mooxli is actually like an acronym for move your mindset, oxygenate your soul, and live differently. And that's the beauty of yoga being a part of what we do at Mooxli, is in moving your body, you can start to move your mind. And shortly after I had that experience with plow pose, we did camel pose, which is, it's very, in yoga, we call it heart opening, but it's putting yourself in a vulnerable position, and it's putting yourself in a place of what I feel is like honesty. And I went home that night. It was in a season of my husband's physical problems getting worse and worse, and my work environment getting more and more toxic. And again, I didn't know why, but I just cried and cried and cried, and it felt so freeing. That coincided with me trying every fix I knew to get through my toxic work environment, and that situation wasn't improving. It reached the point where I knew, for my own emotional safety, I had to transfer out of that environment. And that transition was incredible. I've never gone through anything like it in my life. And that is when I felt like I really just kind of I sat down with myself and was like, okay, as hard as I studied in graduate school, I was like, I'm going to figure this out. And so I started looking around for resources in our immediate health community, and I just wasn't finding what I needed. And out of that was born Mooxli. And if I'm being transparent, I thought, well, if I build this company, maybe it won't be so obvious that like I need all this help too.
I'm really wanting to talk more about just the mess that is, of the shame to show your actual emotions at your job when you're dealing with incredibly intense trauma all the time. I mean, just even going back to the first part of your career at 19 and 20 and young 20s in the ER, there's no mention of how these experiences are affecting you all on a personal level.
So there is starting to be some awareness in the training. There are some health systems that are really starting to pay attention to this. Duke has some great research surrounding gratitude and practitioner well-being and looking at burnout. University of Michigan has done some studies that look at time of day as it relates to anesthesia and how that affects patient outcomes and safety, which that's a form of mindfulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just being aware of how we move through the day and how the circadian rhythms of that do impact us. And we can't look at that and study that without acknowledging our humanity. And then at the end of the day, healthcare systems, the majority of them are not for profit, but it's kind of a misnomer. They are profit driven. And at the end of the day, what is really starting to force awareness by healthcare systems to this need to foster resilience and self-care and mindfulness is studies show that where burnout is high, it costs the system money in the form of turnover, patient safety decreases. It's getting tied to negative outcomes that cost the systems money, which is slowly forcing a light to be shown on this. I connected with Dr. Stevens before any of us knew the pandemic was coming, and her and I had this conversation at that point, before the pandemic, that things were at a tipping point for the individual healthcare provider, and systems that were willing to raise their awareness and build resilient systems were going to start to be the premier providers of healthcare and places to work in healthcare in the country. And that is going to be part of what drives them being competitive, which in the past, systems that fostered a lot of those negative things I talked about were the big, prestigious academic centers to be associated with. There's studies done, again, before anybody knew that a pandemic was going to be part of our professional experience, that over 50% of healthcare workers were burnt out. And so we don't have studies yet that reflect our current rate of burnout, but it's going to be staggering.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we were talking before this, you mentioned burnout doesn't mean you've had a hard day or, 2 hard days. It is like a deep emotional, physical, mental exhaustion that is creating this cascade of effects in your entire being. So for those listening, I'm really wanting to educate on what burnout actually is, how does it present, and what are some of the signs that someone may be headed in that direction or may be smack in the middle of it and are in denial.
That's a great question. Burnout, that term gets thrown around. Burnout is consistent stress that is experienced over time, that it's not processed. It doesn't have an outlet. And in the short term, stress can be good for us, right? Because it drives that fight or flight system, part of our, the autonomic nervous system. And so in the short term, it can be helpful. But in the long term, it can express itself in a lot of ways of frequent headaches. Having heart arrhythmias is unfortunately fairly common among healthcare professionals. If you talk to people that have gone through nurse anesthesia training, the number of them that came out on either blood pressure controlling medicine or heart rate controlling medicine or both is concerningly high. And for a lot of them, that's for the rest of their life. A term that is commonly used and actually measured surrounding burnout is emotional exhaustion, and then detachment. Detachment is what I was experiencing when I felt anger towards the victim of trauma coming in, at midnight on that Saturday shift in the ER. And I felt that detachment because I was emotionally exhausted. So we start to detach from our connection with other people. And studies have looked at this, that the more burnt out and emotionally exhausted you are, again, those patient safety goes down because you start to dehumanize the person in front of you. And then you start to become detached from yourself, and depression, anxiety, and hopelessness are all the things associated with that.
It was important to paint a picture of what that experience is because, I feel like a lot of times when we're trying to measure these things, even, I've had health challenges and experiences where I've gone into the doctor and they've said, "Are you experiencing any depression? What does that mean? Well, are you having suicidal thoughts? No, not particularly. Are you, having trouble sleeping? Yes, a lot." And there's all these different markers and measures for what depression means, what anxiety means. And unfortunately, I feel like we live in such a culture where unless you are hitting rock bottom, everything should be okay. Everything's fine. Even when I look at things like substance use, there's this idea that it has to hit a certain point for it to be something to pay attention to. A lot of people are just saying, "Yeah, I can handle it. I'm good. I'm fine." And then that bar just continues to rise to the detriment of anybody who's experiencing this.
Well, and speaking to the culture that you're describing, administrators are saying to their healthcare staff, during the pandemic, "Thank you for your resilience." And unfortunately, what resilience means for a lot of administrators is that you show up no matter what, and you get it done no matter what, and you come back the next day and you do it again. And the point that you're making is in anesthesia, we have immediate and kind of private access to really strong medications. So the rate of substance use disorders with anesthesia drugs for the providers who get caught is 1 in 10. It's reasonable that it's even higher than that for the ones that are using, and that 1 in 10 doesn't speak to alcoholism. And so what does true resilience look like? We are certified for continuing education credits, which means most healthcare advanced practice professionals and physicians receive a stipend from the hospital to get annual continuing education. So it means that they can now take the annual continuing education money. Most people are given a week of time to accomplish that every year. They can come to Mooxli and they can raise their awareness before they become one of those 1 in 10 anesthesia providers that gets caught abusing anesthesia drugs, or before they become the 10 to 15% of healthcare providers that abuse drug and alcohol in other ways. And so shifting that, bringing awareness, and then I use the term true resilience often when I'm speaking to people because resilience is so misused that some of us have a bristling response to it when we hear it from administrators. Because the truth is, sometimes being resilient means that you say enough. And in a constructive way, you don't show up. And you pause. And you regroup. And you figure out what you need to do so that when you do return to work, you could do it in a mindful and healthful way. And it's very, very slow. But nationally, our healthcare systems are starting to shift and recognize that there is financial benefit to holding space for that type of resilience.
Sarah, where did you find the courage to begin to admit to some of the feelings that you were having and the experiences that you were having with a lot of just the emotional weight and the trauma that you had experienced throughout your career? So many people are afraid to come forward, and it seems to me like there's a lot of suffering and silence happening, and people perhaps feeling like they are the only ones, or if they speak up, they're not, resilient enough or strong enough, or they can't handle what's been given to them. Where did that courage to come forward come from? What were the steps leading up to starting a company that is focusing on this?
So I've referred to some of what my husband has gone through, and 4.5 years ago, that led to him being full-time physically disabled and not able to work as an emergency room nurse after doing that for 20 years. And we sat down as a couple and said, we have no construct for this. We have no mentors in our lives that have gone through this. And we're not going to get through this if we aren't brave enough to go find the right resources to support us. So what he was walking through and what we were walking through as a couple was definitely a huge motivator. And then one of my big mentors in my life, I'll be like, this work is so hard. The feelings feel so big. And she gently reminds me, well, it beats the alternative, right? And I got to the point professionally that if I didn't stop and figure out a new path forward, my alternative was I couldn't continue to professionally do what I had been doing for 22 years. And I had such a strong sense of identity tied to it that there was great fear associated with the incredibly negative feelings I was having towards the profession and with leaving it. And I went through a period of transitioning out of my toxic work environment. You asked how Mooxli was born. I took a solid year, and I had transitioned to a different job as a nurse anesthetist. I had gone from the previous job was frequent call, very long hours, nights and weekends, to it was kind of very set hours and part-time. And I just took a year to get comfortable with being with myself long enough to hear myself and ask, what do you really want? And what is this really about? And what's really happening here? And now I have the clarity to see that part of the fear that I was experiencing at that time is heart and soul. I'm a caregiver. It was so confusing to have such negative emotion about who I'm hardwired to be. But out of that came these incredible gifts of learning about self-compassion. I read Kristen Neff's book pretty early on, and that was such a foreign concept to me. And then even this summer is when I was first introduced to Dr. Dan Libby through Feathered Pipe. Dr. Libby and I talked on the phone for a while because there's some very mutual parallel missions we have in our organizations. But hearing him speak to compassion fatigue in a way that just resonated with me, I had never even understood, even with all the work I had done up to that point. And so going back to who I am, heart and soul, is a caregiver, right? And I thought, I know I'm not the only one who's walking through what feels like a life crisis related to this, because as I started to shift and change, then it starts to attract people, right? And I started to get phone calls and text messages. So the caregiver in me was like, you got to give this. And out of that was born Mooxli.
That's amazing. And I do always love how when you make a decision and as you're on your journey and your path of transformation, others show up. And that sense of community is so important. So important. I mean, it really is such a balm for the wounds of feeling isolated. I mean, community and the people who just understand you right off the bat. You don't even have to explain what you're going through. It's that feeling of, I see you and I hear you and I have gone through similar things. There's nothing that really compares to that, in my opinion.
Well, community is so powerful and it's vital to our survival. And in healthcare, needing help and hurting and needing support is so stigmatized that if as a healthcare provider, you're willing to take the smallest step forward and break down that stigmatism in the smallest way and hold space to say, it's okay to not be okay. I feel like it was that small hole in the dike that just burst the dam open, because there's such a desperate need, and the community that has shown up, it's so powerful, and my life is so full, and I'm so grateful to walk through a different type of support. And I started Mooxli, I think I launched the website 9 months before the pandemic hit, and being able to walk through the pandemic with the Mooxli community has been so powerful.
Yeah, and the timing of that, my goodness, of already needing it so strongly before the pandemic, and of course having no foresight that this is what we would be facing in 2020. How have you shifted into serving people in the times that we're facing versus before the pandemic?
It has been, that peeling the onion process for me to continue to be vulnerable and step forward and share with the community, this is what's coming up for me, and then allowing that to kind of hold space so other people feel free to share as well. And the pandemic challenged me to do that in a much deeper way, because it was so difficult for all of us. That is a fair generalization. It is so difficult for all of us. I would suggest that anybody who is practicing in healthcare right now is burned out. It is such a challenging practice environment. And so it went from, as a business leader, deciding we were supposed to be in Santa Barbara on retreat in April of 2020. So as a business leader, having to make big decisions about canceling, and then what it looked like to cancel. And then I felt like, as a team, the Mooxli facilitator team, we kind of went into crisis intervention mode. And Allie McLean is a fantastic nurse anesthetist who practices at Boston Children's, and she did a YouTube video for mindfulness while wearing an N95. And that kind of went viral in the anesthesia community, because the pandemic brought an awareness to people that had none or were skeptics of this body of work. It forced them to kind of get to that same point I was at. If I'm going to have a way forward in this pandemic, in this difficult environment, I have to start paying attention to these things that I've never acknowledged before. So Allie did the N95 video, and then so that starts with a place of mindfulness. And as you're putting on this PPE, it becomes a very emotional experience. So just to create a safe space for yourself to notice what you notice. And like for my own self, it was fairly early in the pandemic, and I had a string of shifts where I was doing a lot of COVID positive care, and the PPE, you sweat in it in a way, like my calves would sweat. I was like, I just didn't even know these parts of my body could sweat. So it's physically exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. And I had worked an off shift. And so I was going to put a sleep mask on to go to sleep. And I put my sleep mask on, and the double straps of my sleep mask felt like the double straps of my N95. And I emotionally felt panicked. Thankfully, with this work I've been doing, I was able to be mindful and notice what I noticed and pause and hold space for what was coming up for me. But bringing mindfulness to our community to say, these new experiences, here's ways that you can constructively walk through them. You're not alone in your experience that you're having. And then a big challenge early on was that there wasn't PPE, there wasn't adequate PPE. People were being asked to reuse PPE, personal protective equipment, in a way that wasn't consistent with safety standards. And healthcare workers struggle greatly for asking for what we need. And we can't be aware of what we need if we can't first be mindful, right? So practicing mindfulness to check in with ourselves and see, like, what are my values here? A common saying that was being thrown at us early on was, you signed up for this. And that caused a lot of emotional confusion for care providers. Like, did I sign up for this? But it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right to be, marching headlong into this experience without adequate protection. So using mindfulness and bringing that to our community as a foundation for checking in with yourself, listening to yourself, and then mindfulness and resilience are so interdependent. And based on what's coming up for you, using that to process through, what is my big purpose? For me, my big purpose is to move through life in a way that glorifies God. What's my small purpose? My small purpose today is to keep myself safe and to give the best care I can to the patients in front of me. So then we helped the community. We did a kind of emergency interview with Dr. Teresa Stevens of what does resilience look like in this moment. And she gave us some great tools. But another huge struggle we have, unfortunately, is that asking for what we need, as I said. So then we brought in Fotini Economopoulos, who is just a powerhouse of a woman, and her leadership skills in negotiation are just incredible. So then we sat down with her kind of in this emergency interview so that in real time, she gave us the tools of, we identified what we needed through being mindful. We identified how that translated to our values to maintain our own resilience. And then Fotini gave us the tools to ask for that in a way that was constructive for us as individuals and for health systems. And so that was kind of our crisis intervention early on. In addition to that, a lot of private messaging and what was coming up for people and supporting people uniquely in those ways.
Mm-hmm. Those are both videos, right? The one that you did on the negotiations and then one that you did on resilience. Just free videos that can people find those through your website?
Yeah, or the Mooxli channel on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, I watch those as well. And I, even not being in the healthcare field, I found so much benefit from hearing Dr. Stevens talk about resilience and talk about your values and really holding strong to that bigger picture and then breaking it down into, okay, here's my big why. What are my little whys, which could be, the job, the role that you have at your employer, and then, all of these different things. It was very interesting to hear you two talk about the ways that many healthcare professionals think or believe that their big why is their job. And I think a lot of people can resonate with that, even outside of healthcare, of just getting very attached to the identity and the responsibility of the job as your purpose or as your why, when really taking a step back. And when you were just speaking about the different tools that you use, what I was hearing was creating space.
Absolutely. And at that point in the pandemic, I had healthcare professionals contacting me via phone saying, this is what's being asked of me. And, on the phone, they're actively tearful because what was being asked was so inconsistent with their values. They would say over and over again, I have no choice, and lovingly reminding them and holding space for them that there is choice. But for many people, this was the first time that they had awareness brought to these values that are so central to what we do at Mooxli. And so to stand up and say, this is what I need if I'm going to continue to work here, feels like a threat to self, right? Because without clarity, just our training teaches us, like, why would you sacrifice your health? That's ultimately what we do. Why would we sacrifice our emotional and physical health for something that isn't our purpose with a big P? And so we kind of get socialized to the notion that this is all there is. And so giving people the freedom and holding space for, absolutely, it's not all there is. And absolutely, you always have a choice. And Dr. T. Stevens in the interview talks about the book, The Choice. And it's written by Dr. Edith Eggert. We have a Mooxli book club for healthcare professionals, and that was the first book that we did. And Dr. Eggert talks about how even being a survivor of the Holocaust in a concentration camp, she had a choice. And that is such a new notion to healthcare providers, but it is so freeing and it is so powerful.
Mm-hmm. I even am thinking about the people during this pandemic who have become caregivers, mothers who are homeschooling now, and people who find themselves in positions due to the conditions of the pandemic and the regulations and just what we're facing. I'm really grateful to even be introducing people to these ideas in a wider sphere than specifically just healthcare and nursing. So I really appreciate that. And Sarah, perhaps can you speak a little bit about what it looks like to get in touch with you and to find some of the resources and maybe even talk about the retreat that's happening at the Feathered Pipe? Yeah, how can people start to get involved?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to contact me. A lot of people like Instagram. Mooxli has a Facebook page. If you're interested in joining your healthcare professional and you want to join the Mooxli Book Club, you can find the book club, link the group to that on our Facebook page to join as well. You can head to mooxli.com, which is our website, and it's pretty easy if you want to be part of the community that receives our ongoing emails and resources that we share. And then you're always welcome to just email me directly. It's Sarah, SARAH, @mooxli.com. And the whole point of this is community. So please reach out. Please share your stories. When we show up for ourselves, it's so empowering to others. And it's astounding to me, the community that we have formed to this point. And I'm just so excited to see the community we're going to form going forward. Related to the fall retreat, my mantra since March of this year has been everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. So if we are supposed to be at Feathered Pipe September 19th through the 23rd, 2021, that's where we'll be. 22 continuing education units. So a lot of people, like I said, their employers will, pay for it. We are recognized as a provider of continuing education for the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists, but they're recognized as a certifier of continuing education credits nationally. And so if you work in a different specialty, you can just manually on your own take the credits you earn that are certified through us and then apply through your professional organization to have them honored through reciprocity. And if you're curious what that looks like, you could just contact your professional organization. But I love what Joan Mudgett says. She says, at the end of the day, people who are for this will be here whether they're getting the credits or not. That's definitely the point that I was at in my life when I started this journey. So.
Mm-hmm. I imagine it is a combination of learning tools. You'll be together. You will be sharing stories. Is it part continuing education, part rest?
Yeah. So our traditional continuing education experience is you go to beach or mountain destination anywhere USA, and then you spend 6 hours a day in a pretty sterile conference room with a lot of PowerPoint slides. And you do that every day for 4 or 5 days in a row, and then you go home. And all of that talk, for the most part, those lectures are all patient care focused. So if you come to a Mooxli retreat, there is not a single clinical lecture. Everything we do at Mooxli is care for the caregiver focused. So we're turning where we're looking to give care to on its head. And operating rooms start very early in the morning. So every Mooxli retreat starts with an early morning practice, and then we break for breakfast. We really try to avoid kind of the death by PowerPoint approach. And All of our Mooxli team members are called facilitators. They're not lecturers. They're not instructors. They're to come alongside and facilitate. So essentially, from the process you go through from morning to night each day is to start with mindfulness, to bring awareness, and then in the sessions where we're, sitting round table and talking, facilitating sessions, it's tools to bring to what's coming up through this mindfulness and awareness. And then we have an evening practice each night that is very specifically tailored to healthcare providers. Insomnia and disrupted sleep patterns are a huge struggle for healthcare providers. So we do a yoga practice called Yoga Nidra that facilitates restful sleep. We have powerful practice of guided meditation by Joan Mudgett to release those we carry. Because if you practice any length of time in healthcare, you carry so many stories with you. And so creating a space to carry those stories in a loving and meaningful way, rather than in a harmful and potentially toxic way. And then we move through every day that way. And then the last day is really kind of a top-down approach of how do I move forward in my personal and professional life with these new tools.
That sounds wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation and just found so much benefit and so many gems for me and my life. So I greatly appreciate you in this conversation today.
Andy, thank you to you and Feathered Pipe and the beautiful space that you're holding for us as healthcare providers in so many ways. From my first point of contact with the ranch, it has been nothing less than restorative. So thank you.
Wow! Once again, another amazing conversation. I'm so impressed by Sarah, her courage for being brave enough to change the ways that she worked and lived and functioned within her relationship with her husband and her coworkers. Really loved the chance to dig in and talk to her about her purpose and her big why. And just think about that idea of what my purpose is, what my big why is, and where all the pieces of the puzzle fit into that. So I found that incredibly inspiring and, of course, a needed reminder that we and I can't help anyone without getting real about identifying and asking what I need first. That truly, I can never hear that enough. For more information about Sarah and the Mooxli community, you can visit Mooxli.com. That's MOOXLI.com, where you'll find free resources, retreat signups, social media links, and newsletters to help you on your path to self-care. A special thank you to Matthew Marsalic and the Drum Brothers, whose music you hear at the beginning and end of this podcast, as well as our dear friend Jean Shinoda Bolin, who first turned us on to the phenomenon of the dandelion effect and how ideas are carried through the world. This podcast is brought to you by the Feathered Pipe Foundation, a 501c3 dedicated to healing, education, community, and empowerment. If you'd like to help support this project, please visit featheredpipe.com/donate or leave a review wherever you listen to this episode and share with friends. Be sure to tune in to our next conversation in 2 weeks. We cannot wait to share another amazing episode with you. We'll see you then. Have a beautiful day.